The oppressive Georgia sun beat down relentlessly on the cotton fields, the air thick with the scent of sweat, earth, and the faint metallic tang of blood from overworked hands. Every step across the hard-packed soil seemed to echo in the heat, carrying with it an almost tangible weight of anticipation. Moses Jackson arrived quietly, a figure whose presence immediately drew attention but whose intentions remained hidden beneath the calm of his expression. His clothing was simple, a rough spun shirt and trousers, but his posture carried an unexpected authority, the kind that demanded recognition without a word. From the moment he appeared at the edge of the plantation, there was a subtle shift, an almost imperceptible tension that rippled among the enslaved workers and the overseers alike. Children paused mid-task to glance at him, their eyes wide with curiosity and an almost instinctive reverence. Adults whispered in low tones, sharing fragmented stories that had already begun to form around his arrival. There was an unspoken acknowledgement among the workers that Moses was different, something about the way he observed his surroundings, the precision with which he noticed the smallest details, set him apart from any man they had ever known. Even the animals seemed to sense his presence. Horses snorted and pawed at the ground nervously, dogs stayed unusually close to the shadows, and a flock of birds scattered at the mere hint of his movement. The air seemed charged, as if the world itself were aware of the arrival of a figure who could not be easily understood. The Jackson plantation stretched for miles, a sprawling estate of fields, whitewashed buildings, and shaded groves where the enslaved found fleeting moments of respite. It was here, among the tall stalks of cotton, that Moses's presence first began to ripple outward. Small, inexplicable incidents occurred almost immediately. A mule that had been stubborn for weeks calmed the moment he approached. A cart teetering on a hill did not tip over when he walked past. Even the wind seemed to carry his movements, brushing through the fields with a deliberate hush, as if nature itself were acknowledging him. The overseers noticed these occurrences with growing unease, their initial dismissals giving way to a gnawing suspicion that something about Moses defied ordinary explanation. Moses moved methodically through the fields, observing the work with quiet scrutiny. His eyes were sharp, scanning the rows of cotton and the laboring figures with a precision that suggested more than simple attention. Whispers began to circulate, some spoke of him as a man with uncanny insight, others muttered fears of darker powers. The enslaved looked to him with a mixture of awe and guarded hope. There was an instinctive understanding that Moses Jackson carried a force that could not be measured by muscle alone. In hushed tones, they recounted stories of how he seemed to know things he should not know, how he could anticipate the behavior of animals, the weather, even the temperaments of the white men who ruled the plantations with iron fists. The plantation owners, meanwhile, observed him with growing suspicion and unease. 9 different men, each accustomed to command and control, found themselves confronted by a presence they could not easily dominate. They noted the way Moses spoke sparingly but with an authority that suggested an understanding far beyond what they attributed to an enslaved man. At meals, he sat quietly, yet the sharpness of his gaze unsettled them, as if he were silently cataloguing every flaw, every weakness, every secret they believed carefully hidden. Small, seemingly coincidental events began to align in his presence, from inexplicable equipment failures to sudden misfortunes that fell upon the plantation. Each incident added to the mounting tension, leaving the owners questioning their perceptions, their authority, and perhaps even their own sanity. As the day wore on, the shadows lengthened across the fields, stretching long and distorted beneath the blazing sun. Moses walked among the workers, his steps measured, his silence heavy with unspoken intent. Even the older men, hardened by decades of toil and suffering, felt a subtle shift in the air when he passed. Conversations fell quiet, tasks were performed with a new, almost ritualistic precision. The natural world seemed to respond to him in small, inexplicable ways. A sudden gust of wind would scatter the cotton, only to settle perfectly in alignment with his path, or the dogs would follow him without command, their movements synchronized with an unseen rhythm. Night approached, but the heat lingered stubbornly, and the workers paused under the shade of large oaks, exchanging furtive glances. Moses's presence lingered at the edge of their consciousness, an unspoken reassurance coupled with a quiet tension. The overseers, returning to their quarters, whispered among themselves, debating whether these events were mere coincidence or signs of something extraordinary. They recounted minor incidents from the day with unease, noting how each had occurred in proximity to Moses, and how quickly the stories seemed to spread among the workers. Fear mingled with curiosity, an emotional cocktail that left the plantation vibrating with subtle energy. By twilight, Moses stood at the crest of a small hill overlooking the main house. The golden light washed over the estate, casting long, eerie shadows that stretched across the land like fingers reaching outward. From this vantage point, he observed the sprawling plantation, the workers moving like living cogs within a vast, unfeeling machine, and the 9 owners within their homes, unaware of the quiet revolution that had already begun in their midst. The narrative here is steeped in tension, a slow-burning build that underscores the duality of his presence. He is both part of the world he inhabits and yet apart from it, a force that cannot be confined, measured, or easily comprehended. As darkness settled, the first hints of unease crept into the night. Fires flickered in the cabins of the enslaved, whispers spread like wind among the fields, and the overseers felt an inexplicable chill despite the lingering heat. There were small omens, a lantern that swayed without cause, an animal's sudden cry in the distance, and the unsettling quiet that fell whenever Moses moved through the shadows. The stage was set for a story of tension, psychological complexity, and the slow, inexorable unfolding of events that would shake the foundations of 9 powerful households. Evening passed into night, but Moses remained a figure of quiet authority, his presence a fulcrum around which the plantation seemed to pivot. The narrative emphasizes the contrast between his calm, measured demeanor and the growing agitation among both the enslaved and the owners. Each small detail, each subtle interaction, is layered to create a sense of dread and anticipation, a cinematic immersion in the historical, social, and emotional context of the era. The haunting arrival concludes with Moses silhouetted against the moonlit fields, a solitary figure whose influence has already begun to unsettle a world built on control, oppression, and fear, leaving the audience with an enduring sense of mystery and tension. The 9 plantations that surrounded the Jackson estate were each distinct in architecture, management, and atmosphere, yet all shared a common thread of rigid hierarchy, relentless labor, and the quiet terror that underscored the lives of the enslaved. Each owner had his own personality, his own insecurities, and his own methods of asserting control, but none were prepared for the subtle disruption that Moses Jackson would bring. The narrative moves through each estate in turn, lingering on the layout of fields, the placement of quarters, the dense groves of oak and pine that framed the property, and the stark contrast between the owner's opulent homes and the harsh, cramped cabins of the enslaved. There is a deliberate emphasis on spatial tension, how the physical structures themselves reinforce power dynamics while also creating vulnerabilities that would later amplify Moses's influence. At the Thompson plantation, sprawling fields stretched beyond the horizon, punctuated by the occasional barn or overseer's shack. The air was heavy with the dust of dry earth, the smell of livestock, and the faint aroma of decaying vegetation near the swamps. The owner, a man of imposing stature but fragile pride, ruled with meticulous record-keeping and the threat of physical punishment. He prided himself on maintaining order, but small anomalies, a mule refusing to move, a sudden storm scattering the crops, began to unsettle him almost immediately upon hearing of Moses's presence at the neighboring estate. He documented these events in his private journal, often questioning his own perceptions but never daring to dismiss them entirely. Meanwhile, the Calhoun estate was a more enclosed property, with thick hedgerows and a central courtyard where the enslaved labored under the strict gaze of the overseers. The owner, a man deeply invested in religious morality, believed himself to be divinely sanctioned to maintain authority over both land and laborers. When rumors of Moses Jackson's arrival reached him, he interpreted the accounts through a lens of spiritual threat, seeing in Moses not just a man but a challenge to the divine order as he understood it. Religious texts were consulted, prayers offered, and sermons delivered, each imbued with increasing urgency, yet the subtle disturbances continued to escalate, from the sudden disappearance of tools to the inexplicable movement of livestock. At the Wallace plantation, the narrative emphasizes the tension between wealth and fragility. The plantation had flourished before the Civil War, but the shifting economy had left cracks in its foundation. The owner was paranoid, highly suspicious of outsiders, and obsessed with control. When he learned of Moses Jackson, he considered the possibility of sabotage, fearing that the newcomer might carry intentions beyond mere labor. Yet his attempts to intercept news of Moses were futile. Word traveled faster than the plantation walls could contain it. The enslaved, aware of Moses's reputation even before his arrival, began to watch the unfolding interactions with cautious interest, sensing an opportunity to assert subtle forms of autonomy amid the escalating tension. The narrative continues through the other estates, each with its own texture, challenges, and human dynamics. The Hamilton estate, perched near a river, had fields prone to flooding and poor soil, making any disruption especially perilous. The owner, pragmatic yet ruthless, relied on a mixture of coercion and incentive to maintain productivity. Stories of Moses Jackson's presence at the neighboring plantations reached him in fragments: stray comments from workers, mysterious accidents, the shifting behavior of animals, and each story gnawed at the edges of his confidence. He attempted to rationalize them at first, attributing incidents to coincidence or natural causes, but the cumulative effect created an undercurrent of dread that infiltrated every decision he made. Across these estates, the enslaved community shared knowledge and stories with remarkable swiftness. Despite attempts by overseers to suppress communication, rumors of Moses Jackson spread like fire, carried by word of mouth, subtle gestures, and coded messages. Each worker interpreted his arrival differently. Some viewed him as a harbinger of hope, a figure capable of bending the oppressive system to some unspoken moral balance. Others feared him, uncertain whether his power would bring reprisal or disaster. The narrative emphasizes these divergent perspectives, portraying the complex psychological landscape in which Moses operated, and highlighting how fear and fascination intertwined to create a charged, almost electric atmosphere across the plantations. The physical environment itself became a character in this story. Dense woods, overgrown paths, and hidden marshes framed the estates, offering both concealment and danger. Rainstorms would roll in suddenly, obscuring visibility and creating tense moments in which the workers and owners alike felt the presence of forces beyond their understanding. The narrative dwells on these atmospheric details, crafting a sensory experience that immerses the audience in the oppressive heat, the earthy smells, the distant cries of animals, and the weight of human tension pressing down from both the land and the societal structures above. At the Jackson plantation, Moses moved with deliberate observation, noting the contrasts among the neighboring estates and how each owner's personality shaped their approach to labor, punishment, and control. He listened, watched, and acted in ways that remained subtle but increasingly influential. Small interventions, a word of caution, a shift in behavior, an unspoken challenge, set off ripple effects across multiple plantations. Animals reacted to him with subtle signals, fields seemed to yield more or less depending on his attention, and the enslaved began to sense a shifting balance of power, a quiet assertion that their labor, their suffering, and their voices might not be as invisible as the owners believed. The narrative explores the psychological tension among the 9 owners as they each responded in isolation, never fully aware of the collective influence Moses wielded across the region. Letters and journals reveal their growing anxiety, the constant questioning of their own senses, and the escalating attempts to understand what they could not control. Even mundane incidents, tools breaking, livestock behaving oddly, crops failing in patches, were interpreted as signs of an unseen force at work, and the weight of suspicion settled heavily on each man. This web of interconnected unease creates a layered suspense, as the audience begins to see the larger pattern of Moses's influence and the psychological unraveling it triggers. In parallel, the narrative deepens the depiction of the enslaved community, focusing on the quiet strategies of resilience, observation, and subtle resistance that emerged under Moses's presence. Workers began coordinating actions in ways that avoided detection yet increased efficiency and safety, relying on gestures, coded words, and shared intuition. Their perception of Moses as both protector and enigma heightened the suspense, illustrating the profound emotional and psychological impact of one individual's presence on an entire network of human relationships. Evenings at each plantation carried a distinct tension, as the owners attempted to assert control while unseen events continued to disrupt order. Fires in the quarters flickered with unusual patterns, animals reacted unpredictably, and whispered stories of Moses's abilities spread among the workers. The narrative emphasizes the contrast between visible authority and invisible influence, between the rigid structures of ownership and the subtle, almost mystical force represented by Moses. These evenings became rituals of anxiety, anticipation, and observation, with each participant, whether enslaved or free, experiencing the escalating pressure in unique and psychologically resonant ways. The shadows of the plantations culminates in a growing awareness of interconnected disruption. While no single owner could yet articulate the cause, the cumulative effect of Moses Jackson's presence became impossible to ignore. The narrative captures this mounting tension with precise attention to the interplay of environment, human behavior, and social hierarchy, emphasizing that the story of Moses was not confined to a single estate but radiated outward, touching every corner of the 9 plantations. By the close of this section, the stage is set for escalating confrontation, as both the enslaved and the owners are drawn into a web of fear, fascination, and unseen influence that will define the unfolding drama in ways they cannot yet comprehend. Across every estate, the landscape itself mirrored the tension. Twisted paths, overgrown hedgerows, and shadowed corners seemed to hold secrets that only Moses understood. Every nightfall brought new whispers, new fears, and the subtle, almost imperceptible sense that the ordinary rules of control were failing. The narrative weaves together these environmental, social, and psychological threads, creating a densely layered depiction of the plantation's interconnected world. By portraying each owner's response, the physical setting, and the enslaved worker's perception, the story expands into a richly immersive tableau that fully conveys the tension, unease, and mysterious power that Moses Jackson exerted over the region. Through these interwoven narratives, the audience is drawn into the complexity of the 9 plantations, each one distinct yet bound together by shared fear, fascination, and the unrelenting presence of Moses. The tension is cinematic, rising steadily with each anecdote, observation, and unexplained occurrence, painting a vivid portrait of a historical moment in which one man's enigmatic presence challenged the very foundations of an oppressive system. By the end of this section, the audience has a complete understanding of the broader landscape, the competing personalities, and the simmering unrest that will propel the story forward into escalating mystery and confrontation. The cotton fields stretched endlessly under the relentless Georgia sun, their pale stalks swaying in a rhythm that seemed to echo the heartbeat of the land itself. It was among these towering plants that Moses Jackson began to reveal the subtle aspects of his influence, small yet undeniable, that would ripple across the plantations like a quiet, unstoppable current. The first indications were minor and easily dismissed, animals acting unusually, tools inexplicably breaking, sudden gusts of wind scattering harvested cotton, but when patterns emerged, even the most skeptical began to take notice. Workers exchanged cautious glances and hushed words, sharing fragmented stories about the man whose presence seemed to command the natural world in ways that defied understanding. The enslaved men and women watched Moses with a mixture of awe and suspicion. He moved silently through the fields, his eyes sharp and unblinking, observing every detail, the angle of the sunlight, the condition of the soil, the posture and movement of each worker. There was an uncanny precision in the way he interacted with the environment, a deliberate awareness that suggested knowledge far beyond ordinary experience. A mule would stop mid-step, eyes wide, and wait patiently for him to pass. A crow would circle overhead, then descend and settle in a nearby tree as though paying silent homage. These occurrences, though small, accumulated into a growing sense among the enslaved that Moses carried a power they could not fully name but instinctively understood. Stories began to circulate, carried in whispers between the cotton rows. One woman recalled seeing Moses appear where a child had fallen ill, and within moments, the child's cries ceased, though no medicine had been administered. Another worker swore that when Moses approached a field plagued by pests, the insects vanished, leaving the crops unharmed. The murmurs of amazement and fear spread quickly, a network of quiet reverence forming among those who understood the fragile balance of life under the overseer's watch. These whispers were not just idle gossip, they were a language of survival, a way of interpreting the inexplicable and asserting a subtle form of communal power. The plantation owners, meanwhile, were beginning to notice the anomalies, though they attributed them to coincidence, superstition, or human error. The tools that failed, the livestock that acted strangely, and the workers who seemed more coordinated than expected all challenged their sense of control. In private journals and letters, they documented these events with increasing unease, attempting to rationalize the unexplainable through mundane explanations. Yet each attempt to impose logic only deepened their anxiety, as the incidents persisted and intensified, revealing a pattern that could not easily be dismissed. Moses's presence also had a psychological effect on the workers themselves. Where fear had once been a constant companion, now it was tempered with a tentative hope. They observed him closely, noting how he could calm a frightened horse with a mere gesture or redirect the flow of work in a way that minimized punishment while maximizing efficiency. His actions suggested an understanding of both human and animal behavior that bordered on instinctual genius. In quiet moments, they speculated about his origins, his knowledge, and the limits of his abilities, sensing that he was not simply a man but a force that could alter the invisible structures of power that governed their lives. The narrative pays particular attention to the contrasts in perception. To the enslaved, Moses was a figure of potential liberation and protection; to the owners, he was an enigmatic threat whose presence undermined authority. This duality intensified the suspense, as the audience is invited to witness events from multiple perspectives, each colored by fear, hope, and uncertainty. The workers' whispered conversations often occurred under the cover of night or in shaded groves, their language coded, cautious, yet vibrant with speculation. Tales of Moses's foresight, predicting weather shifts, anticipating the movements of overseers, and avoiding punishment with uncanny timing, became part of the collective consciousness, strengthening his mystique. The fields themselves became arenas of subtle power. As Moses moved among the laborers, the natural world seemed to respond. Trees swayed with a gentle insistence, shadows shifted in unusual ways, and distant sounds carried with eerie clarity, as though amplifying his presence. Each small incident was layered with tension: a dropped basket, a sudden animal reaction, or a gust of wind that disrupted work just as it seemed to be proceeding smoothly. These phenomena, while not overtly supernatural, created a slow-building sense of dread and fascination that permeated every corner of the plantations. Moses also demonstrated an uncanny awareness of interpersonal dynamics. He could diffuse potential conflicts among workers with a single word or gesture, redirect tensions before they escalated, and maintain a careful balance that prevented chaos while subtly asserting his authority. The enslaved began to recognize patterns in his behavior, learning from his interventions and gaining confidence in their own quiet forms of resistance. His influence extended beyond individual acts; it shaped the rhythms of labor, the strategies for evading punishment, and the collective psychology of an entire community living under oppression. The overseers' reactions added another layer of complexity. They were trained to enforce obedience, to maintain rigid hierarchies, yet Moses's subtle interventions repeatedly undermined their authority without overt confrontation. Animals would refuse to follow their commands, tools would break at critical moments, and workers would instinctively avoid missteps in ways that confounded the overseers' expectations. Frustration, fear, and suspicion grew in equal measure, creating an environment thick with tension. The narrative emphasizes the slow psychological erosion of control, highlighting the ways in which one enigmatic individual could unsettle an entire system without overt displays of power. As days turned into weeks, the whispers in the cotton fields intensified. Stories of Moses's foresight, his uncanny calm under pressure, and the inexplicable alignment of events continued to spread. Workers began to anticipate the movements of overseers, adjust their own actions to avoid punishment, and subtly influence outcomes in ways that preserved both safety and dignity. Moses's presence became a central force in the daily life of the plantations, shaping both practical activities and the emotional landscape of the enslaved community. Nightfall brought a different kind of tension. The fields, quiet except for the rustle of leaves and the distant calls of nocturnal creatures, became spaces of contemplation, rumor, and quiet planning. Shadows stretched long across the land, and the occasional flicker of lantern light highlighted the contours of the rows, creating an almost theatrical stage for the whispered tales of Moses Jackson. The enslaved gathered discreetly to recount experiences, compare observations, and speculate on the man whose calm authority had begun to challenge the very fabric of plantation life. Through these nights, the narrative explores the cumulative effect of small, seemingly inconsequential events. A basket overturned, a sudden gust of wind, a mule refusing to move, all were interpreted as signals, signs of Moses's influence that reinforced his aura of power. The audience is drawn into a world in which observation, intuition, and communal memory intersect, creating a web of tension that grows denser with each passing day. The quiet, methodical accumulation of these incidents builds suspense, illustrating how control, fear, and hope interact in a complex, psychologically charged environment. By the end of this section, the whispers have transformed into a persistent hum of anticipation and unease. Moses Jackson is no longer simply a man among men, he has become a focal point for both admiration and fear, a presence whose influence radiates outward, touching the workers, the overseers, and the plantation owners alike. The cotton fields, once ordinary and oppressive in their repetition, now serve as a stage for subtle power, observation, and psychological tension, setting the scene for the further escalation of events that will challenge the very foundations of the plantations. By midsummer, Moses Jackson had become a figure whose presence could no longer be ignored. The initial whispers among the enslaved had grown into careful, detailed accounts, shared in secret corners of the plantations, beneath groves of oak, or within the shadowed recesses of cabins. Men and women spoke of moments when Moses had appeared seemingly out of nowhere, intervening in situations with precision and foresight that bordered on the supernatural. One worker recounted a day when a heavy beam threatened to collapse during the construction of a new storage shed. Moses, standing at a distance, lifted his hand subtly, and the beam shifted just enough to avoid disaster, leaving the workers in stunned silence. These moments were never flaunted or dramatized, but they accumulated, forming a mosaic of events that left witnesses in awe and unease. Several enslaved individuals began keeping mental journals of their observations, noting patterns in Moses's behavior. He seemed to anticipate the actions of both animals and people, often arriving exactly when a crisis might unfold. Livestock that had been unmanageable would settle in his presence, fields would yield better harvests when he walked among them, and tools seemed to perform flawlessly under his gaze. The first witnesses struggled to articulate what they saw, words felt inadequate, as if the ordinary language of labor and observation could not encompass the subtle force they perceived. Yet they spoke, cautiously, in hushed tones, to those they trusted, building a shared understanding that Moses was no ordinary man. The narrative shifts to include the perspectives of the plantation owners, who, though initially dismissive, began to record their own unsettling observations. Minor accidents, previously attributed to chance, now seemed to cluster around Moses. One overseer described a wagon tipping at the precise moment Moses passed, narrowly avoiding injury but leaving a lingering sense of deliberate timing. Another owner recorded a series of misfortunes, cattle refusing to obey commands, tools failing inexplicably, and small fires breaking out in unlikely locations. These accounts were written with growing unease, the owners struggling to maintain rational explanations while privately acknowledging the possibility that something beyond reason was at play. Moses himself remained calm, silent, and deliberate. He did not seek recognition for the events, nor did he flaunt his abilities. Witnesses noted the quiet authority in his movements, the way he seemed to observe the smallest details without obvious effort. His interactions with the enslaved were measured and thoughtful, he intervened when necessary, redirected attention when danger loomed, and offered guidance in subtle ways that empowered those around him. Stories circulated of workers narrowly avoiding punishment because of his interventions, reinforcing the perception that he understood both human behavior and the intricate mechanics of plantation life in ways that exceeded ordinary comprehension. One of the most frequently cited incidents involved a sudden flood that threatened a low-lying field near the Jackson plantation. As heavy clouds gathered, the enslaved worked frantically to divert the water and protect the crops. Witnesses recalled seeing Moses calmly moving among the laborers, directing their efforts with gestures rather than words. When the floodwaters arrived, the preparations proved remarkably effective, minimal damage occurred, and the workers later remarked that Moses had anticipated the storm with uncanny accuracy. Such events blurred the line between natural occurrence and extraordinary foresight, leaving both the enslaved and the owners questioning the limits of human understanding. The narrative explores the tension in these accounts. Awe and fear coexist in delicate balance. The enslaved recognized Moses' interventions as protective, empowering, and sometimes miraculous, yet they also sensed an underlying force that could not be fully controlled or explained. Meanwhile, the owners grew increasingly uneasy, documenting incidents in private while attempting to maintain the illusion of normalcy in public. Letters and journals reveal a deepening psychological strain, as the men struggled to reconcile the ordinary rules of labor, discipline, and hierarchy with the extraordinary phenomena unfolding before them. Another remarkable story emerged when an overseer attempted to punish a young worker for a minor mistake. The overseer's anger escalated, threatening to turn into violence, when suddenly, Moses appeared between them, his presence calm yet authoritative. The overseer hesitated, then retreated, inexplicably compelled to abandon his intentions. Witnesses described a shift in the air, a subtle weight of expectation that left the situation diffused without a word of confrontation. This incident, repeated in various forms across different plantations, reinforced the perception that Moses' authority operated on a level beyond physical strength or social position. The narrative also details the reactions of neighboring communities who heard fragments of these accounts. Rumors traveled quickly, carried by travelers, laborers moving between plantations, and the occasional merchant. Each retelling added layers of interpretation and embellishment, heightening the sense of mystery surrounding Moses Jackson. Some whispered that he possessed spiritual gifts, others suggested he had inherited knowledge from ancestral lines, while skeptics dismissed the stories as exaggeration or coincidence. The multiplicity of perspectives created a dense network of belief and suspicion, emphasizing the psychological complexity of the events and the wide-ranging impact of Moses' presence. As the incidents accumulated, the enslaved began to create mental maps of Moses' influence. They noted the times, locations, and conditions under which his interventions occurred, and they discussed the possible significance of patterns that seemed to emerge. This collective observation functioned as a form of informal social organization, allowing them to navigate the dangers of plantation life more effectively. Moses' actions, though subtle, had a profound effect on the rhythm of daily labor, instilling a cautious confidence that ran counter to the oppressive structures surrounding them. The plantation owners, growing increasingly desperate to assert control, convened in private meetings to compare notes. They debated whether Moses was a man of extraordinary skill, a manipulator of circumstances, or something more enigmatic. Attempts to rationalize the incidents often led to conflicting interpretations, further intensifying anxiety and paranoia. One owner suggested he might be using psychological influence over both animals and humans, while another proposed that some form of trickery or sabotage was at play. Yet the consistency and predictability of Moses' interventions defied conventional logic, leaving them trapped between disbelief and a grudging acknowledgement of the impossible. Witnesses reported subtle signs that Moses was aware of the scrutiny he faced. He moved deliberately, sometimes pausing to observe the reactions of both the enslaved and the owners, but never revealing the full extent of his knowledge or intentions. Small gestures, a glance, a step in a particular direction, a carefully timed word, produced outsized effects, creating a sense of controlled inevitability that left observers unsettled. His presence was like a silent conductor orchestrating the rhythms of labor, social dynamics, and environmental response, yet always without ostentation or direct confrontation. One afternoon, an unusual alignment of incidents occurred simultaneously across two plantations. Tools broke, livestock panicked, and workers narrowly avoided accidents in multiple locations, all corresponding with Moses' movements. Witnesses described the phenomena with a mix of fear, reverence, and bewilderment. The narrative emphasizes the psychological tension, the layering of multiple accounts, and the growing realization that Moses's influence was neither isolated nor random. This escalation marks a turning point, as both the enslaved and the owners begin to confront the limits of their understanding and the emergent power Moses wields. By the end of this period, Moses Jackson was firmly established as a figure whose influence could not be ignored. The first witnesses, those who had directly observed his actions, formed a patchwork of detailed accounts that created a cumulative portrait of subtle, precise, and psychologically penetrating power. These accounts, both awe-inspiring and unnerving, solidified his presence as a central force in the region, setting the stage for the conflicts, escalations, and confrontations that would follow. The tension surrounding Moses Jackson's presence reached a new intensity as religious interpretation and human denial began to intertwine. Plantation owners, steeped in Christian doctrine and the cultural rigidity of post-Civil War Georgia, struggled to reconcile the inexplicable events with their understanding of divine order. Ministers were summoned to the estates, their sermons imbued with urgency and veiled admonitions. They warned of hidden sins and the consequences of defying God's will, subtly implicating Moses as both test and temptation. In the great parlors of the plantation homes, owners gathered to discuss strategies not merely of labor management, but spiritual defense, invoking prayers, scripture, and ritual in a desperate attempt to reclaim control over a situation that had already begun to slip beyond their grasp. The enslaved observed these displays of faith with complex emotions. To them, religious supplication by the owners was a mix of theater, desperation, and denial. They recognized the inherent contradictions. Those who wielded divine authority publicly, enforcing morality and punishment, were now themselves trembling before a man whose influence defied all worldly explanation. Moses remained quiet, a figure whose calm presence and subtle interventions rendered both faith and reason fragile in comparison. Workers whispered among themselves, speculating on whether his abilities were divinely sanctioned, ancestral, or born of an understanding of the world that transcended ordinary knowledge. These discussions became both a source of hope and a mechanism of survival, reinforcing communal bonds in the face of oppression. Owners attempted to exert control by invoking spiritual authority over Moses, sending ministers to deliver stern warnings, insisting on prayer sessions, and emphasizing the sinfulness of disobedience. Yet these efforts yielded little compliance. As Moses neither acknowledged nor resisted overtly, he existed in a space that neither accepted nor defied the religious dictates imposed upon him. Minor miracles, animals calming, tools functioning under his supervision, whether seemingly anticipating his movements, were interpreted by some ministers as signs of divine favor, while others feared a darker intervention. The ambiguity fueled a tension that became almost unbearable, leaving each participant, owner, worker, and overseer, questioning the very framework of belief and morality under which they lived. Within the enslaved community, faith and folklore intertwined with lived observation. Some workers interpreted Moses's presence through the lens of ancestral knowledge, drawing upon stories of spirits, healers, and protectors passed down through generations. He became a liminal figure, occupying a space between the human and the supernatural, the known and the unknown. The narrative emphasizes the contrast between this intimate, lived spirituality and the rigid, doctrinal religiosity of the plantation owners. Where one saw fear and moral panic, the other saw protection, guidance, and subtle justice. The resulting interplay of belief and skepticism heightened the psychological tension, casting Moses as a central fulcrum of both reverence and dread. Attempts to rationalize Moses through scripture often produced contradictory conclusions. Some ministers suggested that he was a test sent by God, an instrument through which the sinful would be punished and the righteous guided. Others proposed that he represented temptation or even a malevolent force, challenging human arrogance and the established social order. Owners, desperate to interpret the events in a way that preserved their authority and moral certainty, clung to these explanations even as daily incidents continued to defy logic. Journals reveal the internal conflict of men who prided themselves on knowledge, power, and divine sanction yet found themselves unnerved and destabilized by subtle forces beyond their control. The narrative explores specific incidents in which faith and denial collided. One evening, a minister led a small gathering of owners in prayer, seeking divine intervention against the inexplicable phenomena associated with Moses. As candles flickered and voices trembled, a sudden, unexplained gust extinguished the flames, leaving the room in near total darkness. The participants were left shaken, interpreting the event through their own fears and beliefs. Some saw it as a sign of divine displeasure, others as evidence of Moses's power, and still others attempted to rationalize it as coincidence. The ambiguity of the moment intensified the tension, reinforcing the narrative of uncertainty that had begun to permeate every aspect of plantation life. Enslaved workers observed these attempts at spiritual control with a mixture of amusement, fear, and cautious intrigue. They noted the desperation of the owners and ministers, recognizing in their behavior both weakness and vulnerability. Moses's calm demeanor, his precise interventions, and the subtle alignment of events created a stark contrast with the frantic and often irrational responses of those attempting to impose authority through faith alone. This juxtaposition emphasized his enigmatic influence and deepened the suspense, as the audience could see the widening gap between perception and reality, control and chaos. Owners also began attempting psychological manipulations rooted in faith. They staged rituals, organized prayer circles, and issued proclamations intended to reassert moral authority. Each effort was meticulously documented, often with an anxious eye toward proving the efficacy of divine intervention. Yet these measures repeatedly failed to produce tangible results. Livestock continued to behave unpredictably, crops flourished or faltered inexplicably, and the enslaved continued to navigate labor and survival with subtle guidance from Moses. The repeated failures of these spiritual interventions eroded confidence, leaving owners more fearful and uncertain with each passing day. Meanwhile, within the enslaved community, the blending of faith, folklore, and observation grew more complex. Workers developed narratives that combined ancestral teachings, practical survival knowledge, and eyewitness accounts of Moses's interventions. These stories were shared in hushed tones during breaks, after long days in the fields, and at night by fireside light. They became a form of cultural resistance, allowing the enslaved to interpret events through their own lens rather than the doctrinaire morality imposed by their owners. Moses Jackson emerged as a central figure in these stories, both a protector and an enigmatic symbol whose presence challenged conventional understandings of power, control, and divine justice. The section also explores the mental strain on the owners, whose faith-based attempts at explanation began to unravel under the weight of repeated anomalies. The repeated failures of spiritual intervention created cognitive dissonance. They believed in divine order, yet the world around them continued to defy that belief. This tension is depicted with meticulous attention to psychological detail, emphasizing the growing paranoia, self-doubt, and emotional instability that characterized their response to Moses Jackson. Their private journals reveal the creeping realization that control, spiritual, social, and economic, was slipping through their fingers. Incidents continued to unfold that reinforced Moses's inscrutable presence. Animals that had previously resisted guidance now responded to his movements, tools functioned with uncanny reliability, and crops yielded unexpectedly. Witnesses, both enslaved and free, observed these patterns with growing awe and fear. Even as owners attempted to assert control through scripture and ritual, Moses's calm authority created a persistent sense of inevitability. The narrative emphasizes the contrast between human efforts to impose order through faith and the quiet, inexorable influence of one man who operated outside conventional frameworks. By the end of this period, the plantations had become landscapes of tension, belief, and uncertainty. Faith and denial intersected in ways that heightened both psychological strain and narrative suspense. Moses Jackson's presence challenged assumptions, disrupted hierarchies, and left both owners and enslaved workers grappling with forces they could not name or fully understand. The stage was set for further escalation, as the interplay between belief, fear, and subtle power continued to intensify, foreshadowing events that would push all involved toward confrontation, revelation, and the unraveling of established order. The days following Moses Jackson's arrival grew increasingly tense, the plantations shifting into a state of quiet instability that was palpable to anyone who traversed the fields. What had begun as minor anomalies, tools breaking, livestock behaving strangely, small accidents, escalated into a web of events that no one could ignore or rationalize. Owners, once confident in their authority, now moved with hesitation, their eyes darting to the cotton rows and shadows as if expecting unseen forces to intervene. Each small disruption, whether a cart tipping at a precise moment or a sudden misalignment in the planting rows, fed a growing paranoia that spread through both the enslaved community and the overseers, altering the rhythm of labor, command, and observation in ways that were both subtle and profound. The psychological toll on the plantation owners was immediate and severe. Their sense of control, previously absolute, began to crumble. One owner, meticulous in record-keeping and highly confident in his ability to manage the estate, became obsessed with cataloging every incident connected to Moses. In his journals, he noted the precise times of accidents, the alignment of natural events with Moses's presence, and the reactions of the workers. Each entry revealed growing frustration, fear, and an awareness that logic and authority were insufficient to explain or contain what was happening. The narrative emphasizes these inner conflicts, portraying the unraveling of perceived dominance as a slow, inexorable process fueled by repeated anomalies. Among the enslaved, the impact of Moses's presence manifested differently but no less powerfully. Workers began to coordinate tasks with subtle precision, adjusting their behavior based on observed patterns in his interventions. A field threatened by disease or pests would often be managed more effectively when Moses passed through, and a sudden environmental shift, such as an unexpected rainstorm, seemed to align with his guidance. These instances were interpreted as protective acts, reinforcing the perception that Moses possessed insight beyond ordinary human understanding. Yet alongside reverence lay a cautious fear. The same force that prevented disaster might, in theory, also bring it, creating an emotional tension that defined daily life on the plantations. Incidents of psychological disruption became increasingly frequent. Overseers reported sudden, unexplained accidents, plows malfunctioning, scaffolding swaying without apparent cause, and livestock moving in ways that defied expectation. One particularly harrowing episode involved a wagon overloaded with cotton, teetering dangerously on a slope. The overseer rushed to intervene, but Moses appeared, moving only his hands in a subtle, precise gesture, and the wagon shifted just enough to prevent catastrophe. Witnesses described the moment in hushed tones, emphasizing the eerie calm that accompanied Moses's actions, the almost imperceptible manipulation of circumstance that seemed to defy natural law. Owners' responses varied between aggression, denial, and obsessive scrutiny. Some attempted to punish or confront Moses directly, only to experience failures that left them questioning their authority. One owner struck at a worker under the mistaken belief that he had instigated misfortune, only for a sudden accident to divert attention elsewhere, amplifying the sense of unpredictability. Meetings among the owners, intended to devise strategies of control, often devolved into heated debates, each man struggling to reconcile his religious beliefs, economic priorities, and the growing awareness that Moses's influence could not be contained. The narrative emphasizes the psychological tension, portraying the unraveling of rational order as both inevitable and unnerving. The narrative also examines the environmental consequences of Moses's influence. Fields that had suffered under poor weather or inadequate management began to flourish unexpectedly in his presence. Animals, long unruly, moved with surprising obedience. Water channels, previously prone to flooding, seemed to flow with greater regularity. Witnesses, both enslaved and free, interpreted these events as evidence of a force beyond human comprehension. The contrast between natural order and perceived intervention reinforced the tension, suggesting that Moses's presence operated on both physical and psychological levels simultaneously, influencing outcomes without overt action. Social dynamics among the enslaved began to shift as well. Moses's interventions subtly redistributed power within the community, allowing individuals to navigate labor, punishment, and survival with greater autonomy. Workers coordinated efforts to prevent accidents, anticipate overseers' movements, and manage resources more efficiently, often guided by cues from Moses's behavior. These adaptations enhanced both safety and confidence, yet carried the underlying tension of dependence, the community recognized that while Moses provided guidance, his influence remained inscrutable, and the consequences of misalignment were potentially severe. The narrative details the cumulative psychological strain on the plantation owners, who experienced increasing sleep disruption, irritability, and fixation on anomalies. One owner documented recurring dreams in which fields collapsed, tools malfunctioned, and livestock acted with malicious intent, all centered on Moses's figure. The combination of waking anomalies and subconscious anxiety contributed to a pervasive sense of dread, illustrating how repeated exposure to inexplicable events can erode confidence, rationality, and emotional stability. Observers, including minor officials and traveling merchants, noted the palpable tension during visits, highlighting the extent to which Moses's presence had altered the plantation atmosphere. As incidents continued, Moses's influence extended into previously unaffected areas of plantation life. Harvest schedules, maintenance routines, and even interpersonal disputes were subtly guided by his presence. Witnesses described moments when disputes between workers dissolved without intervention, tools functioned flawlessly under his watchful eye, and labor flowed with an unusual efficiency. The narrative emphasizes the psychological subtlety of these interventions. Moses's power was not overt or coercive, but precise, calculated, and profoundly disruptive to conventional expectations of control. Owners attempted increasingly elaborate strategies to regain dominance. They organized labor with heightened surveillance, imposed stricter rules, and enlisted additional overseers to monitor behavior. Yet each attempt was met with subtle failure. Tools would still malfunction, livestock would act unpredictably, and minor accidents would occur in ways that seemed orchestrated rather than coincidental. The repeated inability to impose control eroded confidence, leaving owners trapped in a cycle of fear, denial, and obsessive observation. One particularly illustrative episode involved a severe storm threatening multiple plantations. Workers scrambled to protect crops and structures, and owners moved to supervise directly. Moses Jackson, present but unobtrusive, guided responses with minimal gesture or speech. The storm passed with less damage than expected, leading observers to remark privately on the uncanny timing and foresight of his actions. The juxtaposition of human anxiety, natural forces, and Moses's calm intervention reinforced the psychological tension and growing sense of inevitability surrounding his presence. The narrative also examines the emotional impact on the enslaved. Workers who had once lived under constant fear began to perceive subtle shifts in their environment, guided by Moses's interventions. Confidence grew alongside caution, creating a delicate balance of empowerment and vigilance. These changes were not openly recognized by the owners, yet they subtly altered the rhythm of labor and social interaction, highlighting the complex interplay between observation, influence, and survival in an oppressive environment. As the days progressed, the cumulative effect of these events became impossible to ignore. The plantations operated under a new paradigm, one in which conventional authority was undermined, subtle interventions shaped outcomes, and both the enslaved and the owners grappled with forces they could not fully comprehend. The narrative emphasizes the layered consequences of Moses Jackson's presence, portraying a slow, inexorable unraveling of traditional structures, social hierarchies, and psychological stability. By the close of this period, the plantations had become landscapes of tension, uncertainty, and subtle power shifts. Moses Jackson's influence, initially confined to small anomalies, had expanded to reshape the daily lives, perceptions, and emotional states of all who lived within the estates. Owners faced growing paranoia, workers navigated newfound confidence tempered by caution, and the environment itself seemed to respond to the quiet force he represented. The stage was set for further escalation, confrontation, and the psychological climax that would define the unfolding drama. As the unsettling events across the 9 plantations continued, the owners began to seek explanations grounded in reason, science, and the limited empirical knowledge available in postbellum Georgia. Journals and private correspondence reveal that men once confident in divine and social authority now struggled to reconcile observable phenomena with accepted logic. They debated whether Moses Jackson's uncanny interventions could be attributed to keen observation, manipulation of natural forces, or psychological influence over both the enslaved and the overseers. Attempts at rationalization were obsessive and meticulous, as the anomalies persisted and intensified, forcing each man to confront the inadequacy of conventional explanations. The narrative details the early attempts to formulate scientific or logical theories. Owners consulted local physicians, mechanics, and scholars in distant towns, seeking guidance on whether the patterns they observed could be explained by natural law, coincidence, or the advanced skill of an individual. Some proposed that Moses had an extraordinary understanding of animal behavior and environmental conditions, allowing him to anticipate accidents and manage labor with precise timing. Others speculated that his interventions were the result of an acute psychological influence, a subtle manipulation of perception and expectation that created the illusion of control over natural events. Observers noted specific instances that defied straightforward explanation. Livestock, normally resistant to control, responded almost instinctively to Moses's gestures, avoiding accidents or moving in coordinated patterns. Tools operated more effectively under his supervision, and fields prone to flooding or infestation seemed to stabilize inexplicably. These phenomena, while potentially explainable through careful observation or planning, occurred with such consistency and subtlety that rational theory struggled to account for them fully. The narrative emphasizes the tension between observable outcomes and the limitations of contemporary knowledge, heightening the sense of psychological and environmental intrigue. The owner's rational inquiries often intersected with superstition and folklore. One owner consulted an itinerant healer to understand whether Moses might possess inherited abilities or secret knowledge of the land. Another reached out to traveling merchants and laborers, compiling stories of his past and observing that rumors of unusual influence often preceded his arrival at neighboring plantations. These attempts to reconcile rational and mystical interpretations created a complex web of thought, in which fear, admiration, and intellectual curiosity collided. The narrative portrays the subtle erosion of certainty as owners attempted to impose scientific or logical frameworks on phenomena that continually exceeded their understanding. Meanwhile, the enslaved community interpreted Moses's interventions through a combination of practical observation and ancestral knowledge. They noticed patterns in his movement, gestures, and timing, often attributing his foresight to spiritual or inherited wisdom. Some believed he had been trained in secret arts passed down through generations, while others saw him as guided by an almost divine intuition. The narrative emphasizes the contrast between these interpretations and the owner's rational theories, highlighting the layered perceptions of the same events and the ways in which belief, observation, and survival strategy intertwine to create a rich tapestry of understanding and tension. Specific incidents illustrate the challenges of rational explanation. One afternoon, a sudden wind threatened to topple a stack of cotton, yet Moses's presence seemingly altered the outcome. The stack remained upright, and the workers nearby were unharmed. Owners recorded these occurrences with growing frustration, attempting to identify patterns, yet each subsequent anomaly defied their attempts at modeling or prediction. The narrative underscores the psychological strain induced by repeated, unexplained events and the growing awareness that ordinary mechanisms of control, logic, authority, and physical intervention, were insufficient to govern outcomes in Moses's vicinity. Owners experimented with controlled observation, attempting to isolate variables in an effort to quantify Moses's influence. They meticulously documented his position, timing, and interactions, hypothesizing that his interventions were strategically planned and executed. Yet even under close scrutiny, the subtlety of his actions eluded precise analysis. Small, almost imperceptible gestures, slight shifts of posture, brief glances, or minor manipulations of the environment, produced significant outcomes, reinforcing the perception that Moses's abilities transcended ordinary human skill. This painstaking observation deepened both fascination and anxiety, as the owners became increasingly consumed by their inability to rationalize his influence. The narrative also explores the role of psychological phenomena in the rationalization process. Owners began to question the reliability of their own perceptions, considering whether fear, stress, or expectation might be amplifying the apparent effects of Moses's presence. They attempted to create experiments, such as instructing overseers to perform tasks in secret or observing interactions from concealed positions, only to find that results continued to confound logic. The interplay between expectation and outcome created a feedback loop. The more they sought to impose order through reason, the more their observation suggested forces beyond their comprehension. Workers observed these rational inquiries with a mixture of curiosity and quiet amusement. They recognized the futility of the owner's attempts to contain or explain Moses, while simultaneously deepening their own understanding of his influence. Patterns in labor efficiency, accident prevention, and environmental response became tools for subtle resistance and self-preservation. The narrative highlights the psychological empowerment of the enslaved, who, guided by Moses's presence, could navigate the plantations with greater foresight and confidence, contrasting with the growing uncertainty and paranoia of the owners. Scientific speculation extended to environmental manipulation. Owners theorized that Moses may have exploited knowledge of soil, water flow, and plant growth to produce consistent yet subtle advantages. While some explanations held partial truth, the precision and consistency of his interventions exceeded the practical limits of contemporary agricultural knowledge. Fields threatened by drought or flooding appeared to respond to his guidance, tools and materials functioned in ways that defied expected wear or failure, and animals exhibited unusual obedience. Each event reinforced the growing tension between rational expectation and the inexplicable, driving the narrative forward and intensifying the psychological stakes. The narrative examines the cumulative effect of these rational and semi-rational theories. Owners became increasingly obsessive, devoting hours to observation, documentation, and speculation, often neglecting the broader management of their estates. Their fixation on understanding Moses created further vulnerability. The psychological strain eroded decision-making, interpersonal relationships, and the ability to maintain authority. Conversely, the enslaved community, attuned to the same phenomena but interpreting them through a lens of lived experience and ancestral wisdom, grew increasingly adept at navigating the shifting environment, further enhancing the contrast between those attempting to control and those learning to adapt. A turning point occurs when owners attempted coordinated observation across multiple plantations. They sought to determine whether patterns of anomaly could be predicted and controlled. Yet, despite careful planning, Moses's subtle interventions continued to defy expectation. Tools failed or succeeded in unanticipated ways, animals acted contrary to commands, and labor outcomes shifted in subtle but significant patterns. The repeated failure of these coordinated efforts highlighted the limitations of rational explanation and amplified psychological tension, reinforcing the narrative of enigmatic influence that had come to define Moses Jackson's presence. The narrative also explores interpersonal dynamics among the owners as their rational investigations collided with fear, superstition, and professional pride. Disagreements emerged over methodology, interpretation, and attribution of causality. Some suggested that Moses was intentionally manipulating outcomes, while others feared he was guided by unseen, possibly spiritual forces. These debates intensified suspicion, paranoia, and rivalry, creating a fracturing social environment that mirrored the broader destabilization of plantation order. Meanwhile, the enslaved interpreted the owner's obsessive rationalization as evidence of vulnerability. They noted the anxiety, miscommunication, and disorganization that arose from futile observation and speculative theorizing. Moses's calm presence in the midst of this unraveling reinforced his role as a stabilizing force for the community, further enhancing his mystique and the perception that he operated on a level beyond ordinary human comprehension. The narrative emphasizes the psychological layering of these interactions, illustrating how observation, interpretation, and influence intersected to create a complex, tension-laden environment. By the end of this section, the interplay between rational theory, superstition, and observable phenomena had reached a critical density. Owners remained obsessed with documentation and explanation, yet their inability to fully account for Moses's actions intensified fear and eroded authority. The enslaved, guided by intuition, observation, and subtle interventions, navigated the same environment with increasing confidence. The narrative positions Moses Jackson as a central, enigmatic force whose influence challenged contemporary understanding of human, animal, and environmental interaction, setting the stage for further escalation, confrontation, and eventual unraveling of established structures. As the months passed, the cumulative effect of Moses Jackson's presence began to ripple through every corner of the 9 plantations, reaching a point where isolation, mistrust, and subtle collapse became unavoidable. The once rigid hierarchies, maintained through authority, labor discipline, and fear, were quietly eroded. Owners struggled to maintain control over the land, the enslaved workers, and even their own families, as repeated anomalies challenged the very structures that had once seemed unshakable. Small incidents that had been dismissed earlier, tools malfunctioning, livestock behaving unpredictably, minor accidents, now coalesced into patterns that could not be ignored, creating a pervasive sense of vulnerability and uncertainty. Moses's interventions, always precise and understated, became the fulcrum of this quiet collapse. Workers who had once depended on strict oversight now coordinated among themselves, anticipating shifts in labor and environmental conditions, guided by subtle cues from Moses's movements and gestures. Fields that had been mismanaged for years began to produce reliable yields, while incidents that previously would have caused significant disruption were mitigated almost imperceptibly. The owners, observing these outcomes, were caught in a paradox. The success of daily labor seemed tied to Moses, yet his presence simultaneously undermined their authority, creating a psychological tension that became increasingly difficult to bear. The narrative details episodes of physical and social disruption that illustrate the growing isolation. One overseer, attempting to assert authority through direct confrontation, found himself thwarted by a series of improbable accidents. A stack of cotton shifted unexpectedly, a mule bolted, and tools malfunctioned in quick succession. Each occurrence, seemingly independent, compounded to create an impression of orchestration that defied logic. Witnesses, both enslaved and free, observed these events with a mixture of fear and fascination, noting that Moses's calm presence at the center of these disruptions seemed to channel a quiet, almost imperceptible control over the environment. Isolation extended beyond the plantations themselves. Merchants, travelers, and neighboring landowners, hearing fragments of reports and stories, approached the estates with caution. Some sought to witness Moses's actions firsthand, while others avoided the area entirely, deterred by rumors of his influence. Letters circulated describing the unusual alignment of events, the precise timing of interventions, and the subtle, almost imperceptible orchestration of outcomes. These accounts amplified the sense of isolation, creating a psychological barrier that separated the plantations from the broader community and intensified the perception that Moses operated in a domain beyond ordinary human experience. The enslaved community experienced a complex mixture of empowerment and anxiety. Guided by Moses's interventions, they coordinated labor, anticipated environmental changes, and subtly resisted punitive measures from overseers. Yet the same subtle guidance carried the weight of uncertainty. Misjudgment or failure to interpret his cues correctly could result in punishment or disaster. The narrative emphasizes this delicate balance, portraying the enslaved as navigating a landscape in which careful observation, intuition, and adherence to Moses's subtle influence were essential for survival. Psychological strain among the owners intensified as patterns of disruption persisted. Sleep became fitful, attention to routine waned, and interpersonal conflict among the landowners increased. One journal describes a series of nights in which an owner dreamed repeatedly of collapsing fields, overturned carts, and chaotic labor, all centered around Moses's figure. The narrative highlights the intersection of conscious observation and subconscious anxiety, showing how repeated exposure to inexplicable events can erode rational thought, authority, and emotional stability simultaneously. Attempts to reassert control grew increasingly desperate and erratic. Owners implemented stricter labor schedules, increased the presence of overseers, and even attempted to isolate Moses physically from key activities. Yet each intervention was met with subtle failure. Crops continued to thrive under his presence, accidents were averted in improbable ways, and animals responded with unusual compliance. Each failed attempt reinforced the sense of inevitability surrounding Moses's influence, deepening both psychological tension and social instability. The narrative explores specific incidents that illustrate the growing collapse of traditional authority. During a harvest threatened by sudden heavy rains, overseers attempted to direct labor through shouting, force, and rigid command. Moses intervened subtly, a gesture redirected workers efficiently, animals responded precisely when needed, and fields were managed in ways that prevented loss. The result was a harvest completed successfully despite the storm, yet the overseer's authority appeared diminished in comparison to Moses's quiet orchestration. These events exemplify the subtle, pervasive nature of his influence and the erosion of conventional control. Isolation was further compounded by the breakdown of communication and trust among the plantation owners themselves. Each man's account of incidents differed in detail and interpretation, fostering suspicion and rivalry. One owner accused another of exaggeration or concealment, while others privately questioned their own perception of events. The narrative emphasizes the fracturing social environment, human networks of authority and collaboration, which had once maintained order, now faltered under the weight of repeated anomalies and the enigmatic presence of Moses Jackson. Moses's influence extended to interpersonal dynamics among the enslaved as well. He encouraged subtle coordination, conflict avoidance, and efficient labor management, all without overt instruction or authority. Workers developed an almost instinctive understanding of his cues, enabling them to navigate the plantations with a degree of autonomy previously impossible under strict oversight. This empowerment, however, was tempered by the uncertainty inherent in interpreting his subtle signals. The same force that prevented disaster could, if misread, contribute to it. The narrative highlights the tension between agency and dependence, portraying the enslaved community as operating in a delicate balance shaped by observation, intuition, and survival instinct. Environmental factors also reinforced the sense of collapse and isolation. Fields that were prone to drought, flooding, or infestation began to respond more reliably under Moses's presence. Animals previously resistant to human control exhibited unusual obedience, and tools functioned more effectively. These outcomes, while superficially attributable to skill or timing, occurred with such consistency that rational explanations failed to satisfy either observers or owners. The narrative emphasizes the subtle interplay between natural forces and Moses's interventions, reinforcing the perception that he operated on a level beyond ordinary human comprehension. The psychological impact on the owners reached a peak as repeated failures to assert control eroded confidence. Meetings to plan strategies became contentious, with each participant questioning both the observations of others and the reliability of their own perceptions. Anxiety manifested in sleepless nights, obsessive note-taking, and even hallucinations for some, creating a feedback loop in which fear, uncertainty, and paranoia fed on one another. This unraveling of both rational thought and social order mirrors the physical and environmental disruptions occurring simultaneously across the plantations. Workers continued to navigate this unstable environment with increasing skill. Observing patterns in Moses's movements, gestures, and interventions, they anticipated crises, coordinated labor efficiently, and minimized risk of punishment or disaster. The narrative emphasizes the contrast between the psychological empowerment of the enslaved and the disintegration of authority among the owners, creating a dual tension that shapes the daily life of the plantations and reinforces the slow-burning suspense of the unfolding story. The culmination of this period sees the plantations operating under a new, fragile equilibrium. Traditional hierarchies remain nominally intact but are functionally eroded. Subtle, precise interventions by Moses dictate outcomes more effectively than overt authority. Owners, increasingly isolated and psychologically strained, struggle to maintain the illusion of control, while the enslaved community, guided by observation and intuition, navigates labor and survival with a combination of cautious reverence and practical skill. By the end of this section, the stage is set for the eventual confrontation, revelation, or deeper unraveling of established structures. Isolation, collapse, and subtle psychological domination define the landscape, emphasizing the enigmatic power of Moses Jackson and the profound, transformative impact of his presence on every aspect of life across the 9 plantations. The initial shock and disruption caused by Moses Jackson's presence gradually settled into a quiet, persistent tension across the 9 plantations. Though the overt incidents of intervention, tools shifting, livestock responding, accidents averted, continued sporadically, their frequency diminished as both enslaved workers and owners adapted to the altered reality. The aftermath was not one of resolution, but of subtle transformation, a lingering shadow that reshaped relationships, authority, and perception long after individual events had passed. The plantations, once dominated by rigid hierarchy and fear, now operated under a fragile equilibrium, where the ordinary rules of labor and control had been quietly rewritten by the cumulative influence of one enigmatic figure. For the owners, the aftermath was psychologically profound. Diaries reveal recurring anxiety, insomnia, and obsessive reflection, as men struggled to reconcile their fading authority with the undeniable impact Moses had exerted. They recorded minor incidents long after they occurred, noting how his interventions had prevented loss or guided outcomes in ways they could neither fully explain nor control. Some grew distrustful of their own observations, fearing that memory and expectation had distorted reality, while others resigned themselves to an uneasy acknowledgement that Moses operated in a domain beyond their comprehension. The narrative emphasizes the slow, pervasive erosion of confidence and the lasting psychological imprint of events that had defied conventional understanding. Among the enslaved, the aftermath carried both relief and continued vigilance. Workers had learned to interpret Moses' subtle cues, coordinating labor, anticipating environmental shifts, and avoiding accidents with a combination of observation, intuition, and collective experience. While his interventions no longer dominated every moment, the memory and patterns of his presence continued to guide behavior. Elders shared stories of his guidance with younger members of the community, creating a framework of collective knowledge and practical survival that endured beyond direct observation. This continuity underscored the profound impact of his influence, shaping not only immediate outcomes but long-term strategies for navigating the plantations. The narrative details moments of reflection and observation that highlight the complexity of the aftermath. Owners occasionally encountered events reminiscent of earlier anomalies, a storm narrowly avoided, livestock behaving unusually, tools functioning unexpectedly. Each recurrence reignited fear and speculation, yet these moments were tempered by the recognition that Moses' influence had become woven into the fabric of plantation life. Observers, both enslaved and free, began to perceive his interventions as naturalized, a quiet force operating in the background rather than a constant, overt disruption. This normalization created a psychological tension in which extraordinary events were simultaneously expected and mysterious, reinforcing the eerie legacy of his presence. Social dynamics shifted subtly but irreversibly. Among the owners, interpersonal distrust deepened, as each man interpreted incidents differently and questioned the veracity of others' observations. Private correspondence reveals lingering resentment, suspicion of exaggeration, and fear that the smallest oversight could result in unforeseen consequences. The narrative emphasizes the fragmentation of authority, portraying a social environment in which traditional hierarchies persisted in name but had been functionally undermined by repeated exposure to inexplicable events and the enduring influence of Moses Jackson. The enslaved community's cohesion strengthened in response to the subtle shift in power dynamics. Observation, intuition, and shared experience became critical tools for navigating labor and survival. Moses' guidance, though less immediately visible, continued to shape interactions and outcomes. Workers developed unspoken signals and mutual understanding, coordinating efforts with a precision born of experience and necessity. The narrative portrays this adaptive intelligence as a form of quiet resilience, highlighting how a single enigmatic figure could transform the social and practical landscape without direct instruction or overt authority. Environmental interactions remained a source of fascination and subtle tension. Fields previously prone to unpredictable outcomes now exhibited patterns of stability that seemed linked to Moses' influence, even in his absence. Animals continued to display unusual responsiveness, and minor incidents of labor or equipment function occurred in ways that hinted at residual alignment with his presence. Witnesses interpreted these patterns through multiple lenses: rational observation, ancestral knowledge, and cautious superstition. The narrative emphasizes the layered perceptions and ongoing uncertainty, portraying the plantations as spaces in which ordinary and extraordinary forces coexisted in uneasy harmony. The psychological aftermath extended to the broader community. Travelers, merchants, and neighboring landowners who had heard fragments of the story approached the plantations with caution or curiosity. Some attempted to witness Moses firsthand, while others avoided the estates entirely, influenced by rumors of subtle but undeniable influence. These external perceptions reinforced the sense of isolation and the enigmatic aura surrounding Moses, amplifying both fear and fascination. Letters and second-hand accounts circulated, often exaggerating or embellishing events, creating a broader cultural narrative that magnified his legacy and extended the reach of his influence beyond immediate observation. Incidents of human error, misjudgment, and subtle misalignment persisted, further reinforcing the sense of a world partially orchestrated by an unseen hand. Owners occasionally attempted corrective action, restructuring labor, reinforcing authority, or consulting advisors, but each effort was tempered by the lingering memory of past failures. The enslaved, accustomed to observing and interpreting Moses' cues, adjusted behavior with increasing skill, demonstrating a quiet mastery over circumstances that contrasted sharply with the persistent uncertainty of the owners. This duality, a blend of empowerment and residual vulnerability, defined daily life and shaped the psychological landscape of the aftermath. The narrative also explores the long-term ramifications for cultural memory and storytelling. Moses Jackson became a central figure in the oral histories shared among the enslaved, a symbol of guidance, foresight, and subtle power. These stories, passed down across generations, preserved the patterns of his interventions, the lessons learned, and the emotional resonance of his presence. Among the owners, his memory inspired both fear and reluctant admiration, documented in private writings that reveal an enduring struggle to reconcile the extraordinary with the ordinary. The narrative highlights the contrast between these parallel memories, emphasizing how perception, belief, and experience diverged while coexisting within the same historical framework. A particularly illustrative incident involved a sudden, localized flood that threatened multiple fields. Workers, guided by memory and subtle cues derived from Moses's past interventions, acted with precise coordination to prevent damage. Owners, attempting to oversee the effort, found their authority diminished as the enslaved community's understanding of the patterns proved more effective than traditional command structures. This event encapsulated the ongoing tension between direct authority and observed experience, highlighting the enduring impact of Moses Jackson's presence even when he was not physically intervening. Over time, the plantation settled into a rhythm defined by residual influence, cautious respect, and ongoing vigilance. Owners adapted reluctantly, sometimes relying on previous patterns of anomaly to guide decisions, while the enslaved operated with increasing confidence and coordination. The narrative portrays this equilibrium as tenuous, a delicate balance maintained by memory, observation, and the quiet legacy of Moses's subtle interventions. The past events continued to shape behavior, social interaction, and perception, illustrating the profound and enduring reach of his presence. By the end of this period, the 9 plantations had been transformed. The aftermath was not characterized by dramatic confrontation or resolution, but by subtle, pervasive change. Authority, labor dynamics, environmental outcomes, and psychological states had all been altered by the extraordinary influence of one man. The narrative emphasizes the lingering shadows he cast, the stories preserved in memory and record, and the ongoing tension between ordinary life and the extraordinary forces that had quietly reshaped it. Even after Moses Jackson had departed from the 9 plantations, his presence remained a quiet, pervasive force. Owners continued to notice subtle anomalies, a field yielding better than expected, livestock responding unusually, or tools functioning with improbable efficiency. Each incident reignited anxiety and speculation, reinforcing the sense that Moses had altered the ordinary rules of life. While they tried to rationalize outcomes through observation, logic, or appeals to divine guidance, the cumulative weight of these events created an ongoing tension between understanding and mystery. For the enslaved, Moses's influence became a practical guide embedded in memory and practice. Workers coordinated labor, anticipated environmental changes, and navigated hazards by following subtle patterns they had learned under his guidance. This knowledge, passed down through stories and observation, became a source of quiet empowerment, allowing them to manage daily tasks with a precision that seemed almost instinctive. His legacy, both practical and symbolic, shaped the way the community organized itself, creating continuity and stability even in his absence. Environmental patterns continued to reflect his subtle guidance. Fields that had been unpredictable now exhibited more consistent yields, and livestock behaved with unusual responsiveness. These outcomes reinforced the perception of Moses as a figure whose influence extended beyond direct action, subtly reshaping both human behavior and the natural environment. The owners, while formally in charge, increasingly relied on patterns established during his presence, revealing how deeply his interventions had restructured the rhythm of plantation life. Stories of Moses circulated locally, blending observation with folklore. Merchants, neighbors, and travelers shared accounts that emphasized his uncanny ability to orchestrate events with minimal effort. These stories heightened both fear and fascination, reinforcing his enigmatic reputation. The plantations had been transformed by his quiet interventions. Authority, labor, and environmental outcomes now bore the lasting mark of his subtle control. Moses Jackson's enduring enigma was not defined by overt acts but by the subtle, persistent influence that continued to shape lives, perceptions, and the very landscape of the plantations long after he had gone.